Simba's first appearance at the top of Pride Rock is accompanied by more than just solemn music. It is something more. A carefully planned political ritual. Animals of all kinds, from elephants to ants, travel great distances and gather at the foot of the rock to welcome the new heir. At first glance, it appears to be a display of universal harmony and unity. But look deeper. All these creatures are standing below, bowing their heads before the power towering above them. One is above, all the others are below. Is this a random composition, or the circle of life is perhaps the most famous philosophical concept from the Lion King universe, presented as a harmonious balance of nature where everyone has their place. But what if this beautiful metaphor hides something completely different? What if, instead of a philosophy of interconnectedness and harmony, we are presented with a carefully crafted ideology of control and the maintenance? The political philosophy of Pride Lands is never discussed directly, but it permeates the entire visual and narrative arc of the films. From the geographical organization of the territory to the social structure, everything points to a complex political system where the circle of life serves not simply as an explanation of the natural balance, but as an ideological justification. When Mufasa explains to young Simba that everything the sun touches belongs to them, he is not just giving a geography lesson. He is formulating a doctrine of territorial expansion and control, justifying the lion's right to vast lands by the simple fact of their position in the food chain. And when he talks about the need to respect all creatures, he is in fact laying the foundations for the ideology of noble rule, a concept remarkably similar to Plato's noble lie, or Machiavelli's principles of effect. It is noteworthy that the circle of life is never questioned by most of the characters. It is accepted as a given, as the natural order of things. Such uncritical acceptance is a characteristic feature of a deeply rooted ideology. As the French philosopher Louis Althusser wrote, "Ideology works best when it is invisible." The circle of life is so ingrained in the minds of the inhabitants of Pride Lands that they are unable to see its political nature. Take a look at Pride Rock itself, the central symbol of the entire franchise. It is not just a convenient place for a lion pride to live. It is a political center, an architectural embodiment of power. The structure towering over the plain allows the lions not only to survey their domain, but also to constantly demonstrate their dominant position to all inhabitants of the savanna. The ceremony of presenting the heir takes place at the highest point of the rock, a visual metaphor for the absolute verticality of power. When Rafiki lifts little Simba above the gathered animals, it is not just a touching moment. It is a demonstration of the legitimacy of power, which is passed from one generation to the next. All the animals do not simply welcome the new prince. They acknowledge their subordination to the future ruler. And they do so willingly, even enthusiastically. Herbivores bow down before the predator who will hunt them in the future. A paradox? No, a flawlessly functioning ideology. It is telling that the only creatures who openly challenge the principles of the circle of life are the hyenas, inhabitants of the Shadowlands. They live outside the boundaries of the civilized society of Pride Lands, excluded from the distribution of resources and opportunities. They are portrayed as chaotic, aggressive, and short-sighted. But isn't it natural that those excluded from the system are the first to see its injustice? However, even the hyenas' protest ultimately serves to reinforce the ideology of the circle of life. Their image as violators of the natural order allows the ruling elite of Pride Land to consolidate their power by uniting all decent citizens against a common threat. According to Antonio Gramsci's theory of hegemony, any successful ideology must create an image of the other in order to define the boundaries of the norm and strengthen group identity. Hyenas perform this function perfectly. When Simba returns to overthrow Scar, he acts not as a revolutionary, but as a restorer. He does not change the system, he restores the old order. And the first thing he does after his victory is to banish the hyenas back to the Pride Lands, restoring the former geography of political exclusion. Behind all the rhetoric about restoring balance lies a simple truth: a return to the old system of power and resource distribution. In this context, the famous song, "The Circle of Life," takes on a new meaning. From dawn to dusk is not only a poetic description of time, but also a metaphor for the cyclical nature of power and its inevitable reproduction. Simba can take Mufasa's place, but the structure of power remains unchanged. We are all connected in the circle of life. This phrase is now read not as a hymn to interconnectedness, but as a reminder of the impossibility of But if the circle of life is a political ideology, who created it? Who is behind its spread and maintenance? The answer may be surprising, and it will make us look at one of the most charismatic characters in the entire franchise in a new light. To understand the full depth of Prideland's political philosophy, we need to carefully analyze how the Circle of Life is presented in the canon. Let's turn to a key scene, Mufasa's lesson to Simba about the nature of royal power. Standing atop a hill at dawn, Mufasa utters the famous words, "Everything you see is what you will one day be." A king must understand this balance and respect all creatures, from the tiniest ant to the leaping antelope. At first glance, this seems like the wisdom of an enlightened monarch who cares about his subjects. But let's look deeper. What is Mufasa really saying? Everything you see is a declaration of total ownership of an entire ecosystem. Territory, resources, even the lives of other creatures, everything is part of the prince's inheritance. At the same time, Mufasa does not explain the basis for this right. It is presented as natural, given by nature. This is a classic example of the naturalization of power, a technique by which it is noteworthy that this lesson is accompanied by a literal elevation. Father and son climb a hill that offers a panoramic view of their domain. The camera angle, the visual composition of the frame, everything works to reinforce the idea of the lion's supremacy and supreme position over the rest of the world. The ensuing "But Dad, don't we eat antelopes?" Yes, Simba, but let me explain. When we die, our bodies become grass, and the antelopes eat the grass. That's how we're all connected in the great circle of life. Think about this logic. Mufasa does not deny that lions eat antelopes. He simply places this act in a circular context, where ultimately antelopes also eat lions, albeit indirectly. A beautiful metaphor? Undoubtedly. But it is also a brilliant example of what sociologist Pierre Bourdieu would call symbolic violence. A way of justifying real inequality with abstract. Antelopes, of course, cannot directly object to this interpretation of their role in the balance. The lion's interpretation of the circle of life becomes the dominant narrative that determines how all the inhabitants of the Pridelands understand the world and their place in it. Here we see a classic example of what Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci called cultural hegemony, a situation in which the worldview of the ruling class becomes accepted and perceived as natural and inevitable. Of particular interest is the concept of balance, so insistently promoted by Mufasa. Balance implies a kind of equilibrium, a fair distribution. But is the Prideland system really balanced? In the real world, lions make up a tiny fraction of the savanna's biocoinosis, whereas in the ideology of the circle of life, they are presented as the central organizing element. Their numerical. Consider another aspect of Mufasa's lesson, the definition of the kingdom's borders. What about that dark land? Simba asks, pointing to a gloomy area on the horizon. That is beyond our kingdom. You must never go there, Mufasa replies. Here we see the creation of a spatial political other, a territory defined exclusively by its opposition to the civilized space of the Pridelands. The Shadowlands fulfill a critically important political function. They serve as the antithesis of the right order, a vivid illustration of what happens when the circle of life is broken. This space is necessary to legitimize the power of the ruling elite, who can point to it and say, "This is what awaits us all if we deviate from the established order." It is noteworthy that the inhabitants of the Shadowlands, hyenas, are portrayed as chaotic, undisciplined, and incapable of self-organization without external leadership. Later, when Scar seizes power and allows the hyenas to enter Pridelands, we see an immediate transformation of the landscape. The green, flowering land becomes gray and lifeless. This could be attributed to poor resource management, but the animated film offers a more straightforward interpretation. The very presence of incorrect elements destroys the harmony of the environment. The political metaphor is hard to miss. Violating the established order leads to decline. The structure of social roles within the lion pride deserves special attention. Lionesses are responsible for hunting and gathering food, raising cubs, and essentially all reproductive and productive work. Male lions, represented by Mufasa and later Simba, perform mainly representative functions. They patrol the territory, hold diplomatic meetings with other species, and resolve disputes. This strict segregation of duties is presented as a natural part of the circle of life, although in reality lion prides have much more complex. Mufasa's political lessons are not limited to geography and ecology. He also teaches Simba the concept of royal responsibility. Being king is much more than just doing what you want, he tells his son. At first glance, this is a lesson in self-restraint and duty. However, in a political context, it is also a guide to effective governance. A monarch should not abuse his power to the point of provoking resistance from his subjects. Here, Mufasa demonstrates a deep understanding of what political scientists call consensual hegemony, power based not on direct coercion, but on the voluntary acceptance of one's position by subordinates. Lions do not patrol every corner of the Pride Lands, forcing other animals to obey. The animals themselves come to the ceremony to introduce the new heir and bow down before Simba. The circle of life works so well precisely because it is internalized by all participants. Even more telling, Simba's political education begins long before he is able to critically interpret the information he receives. Mufasa does not simply teach his son, he prepares an ideological heir to the system. When Simba sings, "I can't wait to be king," his idea of royal power is still naive and egocentric. But this song is not just a comic number. It is a reflection of an immature understanding of power that needs to be corrected and directed in the right direction. Thus, Mufasa's formal lessons are complemented by informal ideological education, which shapes the heir's correct understanding of his role. Simba must not simply inherit the throne, he must inherit and reproduce the entire ideological structure that supports the existing order. And what happens when this process of political socialization is interrupted? When Simba runs away and spends years away from Pride Lands, he forms an alternative philosophy, Hakuna Matata, which means no worries. This philosophy is directly opposed to the idea of royal responsibility, and it is telling that when Simba finally returns, he has to undergo ideological re-education once again. This time not from his father, but from another king. When we begin to analyze the Lion King through the lens of political philosophy, we discover a striking correspondence between its principles and real-world systems of social control. French philosopher Michel Foucault developed the concept of biopower, a form of governance that regulates entire populations through control over their biological processes. In Pride Lands, we see a classic example of such biopower. The ruling elite determines who lives where, who eats what, and even who has the right to reproduce. Consider the economic structure of Pride Lands. Despite the rhetoric of balance and interconnectedness, the distribution of resources is fundamentally unequal. Lions, who make up an absolute minority of the population, consume a disproportionate share of the savanna's resources. They are at the top of the food chain and use this biological advantage to consolidate their Recall the scene of the lionesses hunting at the beginning of the film. We see them coordinating their pursuit of a herd of antelopes. This is presented as a natural process, part of the circle of life. However, in a political context, this is an example of the systematic appropriation of vital resources by the ruling elite. The lionesses do not return with their prey to a neutral zone, but to Pride Rock. What is even more telling is that the herbivores, who make up the majority of the Pride Lands population, accept this order. They do not organize an uprising or rebel against their potential predators. Instead, they come to honor the birth of a new hunter who will hunt them. This is the highest manifestation of ideological hegemony, a state in which subordinate groups have completely internalized the antelopes, zebras, and other herbivores of the Pride Lands resemble what Italian philosopher Antonio Gramsci described as a passive consensus, a situation in which subordinate classes accept their subordinate position not because of direct coercion, but because they cannot imagine an alternative order. The cycle of life is so deeply rooted in their consciousness that the very idea of changing it seems. Another aspect that deserves attention is the gender division of labor within the lion pride. Lionesses perform almost all productive work. They hunt, care for the cubs, and maintain the social structure of the group. At the same time, political power and decision-making are concentrated in the paws of male lions. Mufasa, and later Simba, determine the course of the entire community, although their direct contribution to its material well-being is minimal. Remarkably, this division is never challenged. No lioness expresses a desire to become queen instead of king, or to take on political leadership. Sarabi, portrayed as a strong and respected figure, nevertheless fully accepts her role as queen consort rather than independent ruler. And Nala, even after demonstrating her ability to defeat Simba in combat, never claims a role beyond the traditional distribution. This distribution of power and labor is presented as natural, part of the circle of life. However, it is in fact a political construct designed to maintain the existing hierarchy. Real lion prides have a much more complex social organization, where females often play a dominant role, especially in matters of Hyenas and the Shadowlands play a special role in the political system of Pride Lands. They function as a constitutive outside for the identity of Pride Lands, that which Pride Lands are not and must never become. Post-structuralist philosophers note that any identity system needs an other through which it defines itself. It is significant that hyenas are caricatured as stupid, unclean, and lacking in self-control. They laugh at inappropriate moments, constantly fight among themselves, and are incapable of maintaining order without external guidance. This caricature is not accidental, but a necessary element of ideology. To justify their exclusion from the good society of Pride Land, they must be portrayed as fundamentally incapable of In reality, hyenas are highly organized social animals with a matriarchal structure, complex rituals of interaction, and their own political hierarchy. Their portrayal in the film is a classic example of the ideological dehumanization, or in this case, de-animalization, of political. When Scar comes to power and allows the hyenas to enter Pride Lands, we see the instant degradation of the ecosystem. Grass disappears, water bodies dry up, herds leave. This is such a radical change that it cannot be explained by ecological factors alone. The film visually reinforces the idea that the very presence of wrong elements destroys the natural balance. Here we encounter a very specific political metaphor. Scar's rule and the presence of hyenas are presented as literally contrary to nature, contrary to the natural order of things. This allows any action against them to be justified as a restoration of the norm, a return to the right state of the world. It is noteworthy that when Simba returns and overthrows Scar, his first act is to banish the hyenas back to the Pride Lands. Not integration, not an attempt to create a more inclusive society, but a restoration of the previous segregation. Most importantly, this is presented not as a political decision, but as a restoration of the natural order. Grass begins to grow again, animals return, water appears in streams. Nature itself seems to approve of the restoration of the old. This moment illustrates one of the central mechanisms of ideology, the naturalization of the political. Socially constructed power relations are presented as part of the natural order, which makes them impervious to criticism and change. How can one oppose In his book Mythologies, French semiologist Roland Barthes described myth as depoliticized speech that turns history into nature, presenting man-made structures as natural and eternal. The circle of life is a perfect example of such a myth. It masks complex political relations between different groups. It is important to note that the circle of life does not simply explain the world. It actively legitimizes the existing hierarchy of power. It not only describes how the world works, but also prescribes how it should work. In this sense, the circle of life functions as a classic foundational ideology, a belief system that justifies and retrospectively validates the existing order. When Mufasa tells Simba about the balance that must be respected, he is actually talking about the need to maintain the status quo, the existing power structure. Balance in this context does not mean equality or justice, but rather the preservation of the established hierarchy. It is telling that the only imbalance in the film is considered to be the attempt to change this hierarchy, rather than the numerous injustices that this hierarchy engenders. Ultimately, the circle represents what political scientist Michael Mann called ideological power, the ability to determine how society understands the world and its place in it. And this is perhaps the most effective form of power, as it does not require constant coercion. When subordinates accept the ideology of the dominant as their own, there is no need for guards or prisons. The system reproduces itself through the But if the circle of life is an ideology, then it must have creators and guardians. Who in Pride Lands is responsible for formulating, disseminating, and maintaining this comprehensive system of beliefs? The lions certainly benefit from it, but they have neither the time nor the intellectual resources to develop and maintain it. This role requires someone else. Someone wise, respected by all species, with access to mystical knowledge. And there is such a character. When we analyze the political structure of the Pride Lands, our gaze naturally focuses on the monarchs, Mufasa, Scar, Simba. They occupy a central position in the narrative. They make the decisions. They seem to control the course of events. But what if the real power lies in other hands? Or more accurately, in other paws? Consider Rafiki, the wandering mandrill with his quirky behavior and eccentric wisdom. He is traditionally perceived as a kind mentor, a spiritual guide, a comic character. But upon closer inspection, something much more complex and politically significant emerges. Rafiki is not just an advisor to kings. he is the true ideological architect of the. The first thing that catches the eye is his special position in the social structure of the Pride Lands. Rafiki belongs neither to the herbivores nor to the predators. He stands outside the main socio-economic groups, which gives him unique independence and mobility. At the same time, he is universally respected. Lions do not hunt him, and other animals do not perceive him as a threat. This position above the fray is ideal for the role of ideologist. He can formulate and disseminate ideas that will be perceived not as the expression of someone's private interests, but as a. Rafiki possesses all the attributes of what German sociologist Max Weber called charismatic power. He has a staff, a visual symbol of authority. He has special knowledge. He can communicate with the souls of departed kings. He has rituals. He creates mystical signs and performs ceremonies. All this shapes the image of not just a wise man but almost a priest or shaman, a figure standing between the material and spirit. But the most telling element of Rafiki's role is his drawings. In his tree home, he creates and maintains an entire gallery of images of the royal family. These drawings are not just decorative elements or sentimental reminders. They are a visual chronicle of the dynasty, the official historiography of Pride Lands. In the scene where Rafiki learns of Simba's return, we see him add a red mane to the painted image of the prince. This moment is presented as an emotional revelation, but from a political point of view, it is much deeper. Rafiki is not simply recording reality. He is actively creating the official narrative, determining who is included in the dynastic line and who is excluded from it. Imagine for a moment, what would have happened if Rafiki had decided to draw a mane on Scar's image, or to create a portrait of one of the hyenas? Such an act would have instantly legitimized an alternative political configuration. Control over the historical narrative is one of the key elements of any ideological system. Those who write history determine how a society understands its past, and, consequently, its present and future. Rafiki, with his drawings and stories, performs a function that French philosopher Louis Althusser would call an ideological state apparatus, an institution that disseminates and maintains the dominant. Even more telling is Rafiki's role in legitimizing power through ritual. Remember the ceremony introducing Simba at the beginning of the film. It is not Mufasa or Sarabi, but Rafiki who lifts the newborn prince before the assembled animals. This gesture is not merely symbolic. It is an act of transferring legitimacy, a public confirmation. In political science, legitimacy is the recognition of the right of power to exist and function. Without legitimacy, no power can exist for long, even if it has the physical force to maintain order. In many cultures, religious or spiritual leaders have historically performed the function of legitimizing political power, from Egyptian priests performing rituals for pharaohs to medieval bishops crowning European monarchs. Rafiki performs this function in Pride Lands. He endows the monarchy with sacred status, linking it to mystical powers and ancient traditions. When he paints a mark on little Simba's forehead before presenting him to his subjects, he is effectively performing an anointing ritual similar to the religious coronation ceremonies. More significantly, Rafiki does not simply uphold the existing order, he actively participates in restoring it when it is threatened. When Simba, living a carefree life in the jungle under the philosophy of Hakuna Matata, resists returning to his role in Pride Lands, it is Rafiki who convinces him to accept his destiny. Analyzing their famous conversation scene in the night forest, we see a masterful example of ideological work. Rafiki does not simply remind Simba of his father. He reinserts him into the dynastic narrative from which he tried to escape. The phrase, "he lives in you," is not just sentimental consolation. It is an assertion of the indestructibility of dynastic succession, despite the physical death of an individual monarch. "The king is dead, long live the king," is a classic formula of monarchical legitimacy, translated into the language of spiritual wisdom. And Rafiki's behavior in this scene, he teases, manipulates, hits Simba with his staff, leads him through the dark forest to a mystical pond. This scene is structurally reminiscent of a classic initiation rite. The neophyte undergoes trials, receives secret knowledge from an elder, and is reborn in a new capacity. Rafiki acts here as a priest performing a ritual of ideological reintegration. It is also worth noting how Rafiki communicates with other characters. He speaks in riddles, uses metaphors, and never expresses himself directly. This manner of speech creates an impression of profound wisdom, but also serves a pragmatic purpose. It makes it difficult to directly challenge his statements. How can you argue with someone who says, "The past can hurt, but as I see it, you can either run from it or learn from it"? This is a rhetorical device that philosophers call Immunization against criticism. Formulating statements in such a way. Rafiki's dwelling plays a special role, a huge ancient tree with its drawings and artifacts. It is not just a house, but a real ideological center of Pride lands, analogous to a temple or library. It stores the visual history of the dynasty, rituals are performed here, and prophecies and interpretations of omens originate from here. In modern terms, Rafiki's tree could be called a Ministry of Truth, an institution that controls the production and distribution. It is noteworthy that neither Mufasa, Simba, nor even Scar ever encroach on Rafiki's authority in his specific sphere. Even when Scar seizes political power, we do not see him attempting to destroy Rafiki's drawings or discredit his wisdom. This may indicate that Rafiki's ideological power is so deeply rooted in the minds of the Prideland's inhabitants that even a usurper does not risk challenging it directly. Ultimately, Rafiki's role in the circle of life system can be compared to that of the intellectual elite in any society. He formulates, disseminates, and defends the fundamental ideas that justify the existing order. He gives shape to vague feelings and intuitions into a coherent worldview. He creates narratives that allow the world to be understood in a certain way. Most importantly, Rafiki does all this while maintaining the appearance of neutrality and universality. He does not present his ideas as an expression of the interests of lions or any other group. He presents them as objective wisdom available to anyone willing to listen. This is a classic technique of ideological work, presenting the particular as universal, presenting an interested position as neutral and objective. Thus, the real guardian of power in Pridelands is not the king on Pride Rock, but the ideologue in his tree. Monarchs come and go, but the system reproduces itself as long as there is an institution that formulates and disseminates its fundamental ideas. In this sense, Rafiki does not simply support the circle of life. He is the circle of life, its living embodiment and chief guardian. This understanding of Rafiki's role forces us to rethink the entire political dynamics of Pridelands. If real power lies not in the hands of monarchs but in the hands of an ideologue, how does that change our understanding of the conflict between Mufasa and Scar, between Simba and Scar? Perhaps the real struggle is not for physical control over the territory, but for the right to determine what ideas shape the consciousness of its inhabitants. In light of our analysis, we must radically rethink the traditional view of Mufasa's reign as an ideal of noble leadership. What is presented as wise and just rule, upon closer inspection, turns out to be a complex system of ideological control that sustains fundamental inequality. Mufasa is not simply a benevolent protector of his territories. He is the guarantor of a social hierarchy in which lions occupy an exclusive position. His often quoted advice to Simba is not just parental advice, but a textbook on maintaining political dominance. When he talks about balance, he is really talking about preserving the existing distribution of power and resources. When he warns against visiting the Pride lands, he reinforces the geographical boundaries of the political system. Even more telling, Mufasa never questions the structure of the circle of life itself. He doesn't wonder if it's fair that lions are dominant, or if hyenas could be integrated into Prideland society. For him, like any ideal member of the ruling class, the existing order seems like the only possible and natural way things are. This forces us to take a fresh look at the confrontation between Mufasa and Scar. Traditionally, this is presented as a struggle between good and evil, between a just ruler and a usurper. But from a political point of view, their differences are much less radical. Both are representatives of the same class. Both seek control over the same resources. The only difference is in their methods of governance and their attitude toward. Mufasa is an experienced ideologue who understands that the long-term stability of the system requires the voluntary participation of his subjects. That is why he talks about balance, respect for all creatures, and interconnectedness. He creates the illusion of common interests where there is actually conflict. This is a classic example of what political scientists call hegemonic rule, power based on ideological consensus rather than direct coercion. Scar, on the other hand, takes a more straightforward approach. He doesn't bother with ideological constructs, ruling through fear and open violence. He doesn't hide his selfishness or try to make his rule seem good for everyone. This is life, unfair by its very nature, he tells the hyenas, articulating a harsh truth that Mufasa would never have uttered aloud, even though it is telling that Scar, this usurper and villain, does one thing that Mufasa would never have done. He integrates the hyenas into Prideland society. Of course, he does so for selfish reasons, using them as his personal army. But the very fact of breaking down the rigid segregation established by previous monarchs is a potentially revolutionary step. The problem is that Scar does not offer a real alternative. He does not create a new, more just system of resource and power distribution. He simply redistributes privileges, allowing hyenas to participate in the exploitation of other species. Instead of eliminating hierarchy, he simply changes its configuration. That is why his rule leads to ecological disaster. He destroys the old system but does not create a viable. Simba's return, presented as a triumph of justice, is, from a political point of view, simply a restoration of the old order. It is noteworthy that his first act after defeating Scar is to banish the hyenas back to the Pride Lands, restoring the very segregation that his predecessors had established. Here again, we see the skill of ideological work. This action is presented not as a political decision, but as a restoration of the natural balance. The expulsion of one group, which makes up a significant part of the population, is not called ethnic cleansing. It is called a return to the circle of life. But perhaps most surprising is that both Scar and Simba, despite their differences, recognize Rafiki's authority. Even when Scar seizes power, we do not see him attempt to eliminate the mandrill or refute his wisdom. And when Simba resists returning to Pride Lands, it is Rafiki who convinces him to accept his destiny. This points to the exceptional role of ideological authority in a system where even political opponents accept. In light of all this, a logical question arises. Is there any alternative to the circle of life as a political system? Is it possible to imagine Pride Lands organized on the principles of real equality and justice, rather than euphemisms about balance and interdependence? The difficulty lies in the fact that any fundamental critique of an ideological system must, in one way or another, use concepts and categories created within that system. As French philosopher Jacques Derrida said, there is nothing outside the text. We always think within existing discursive structures, even when we try to critique them. This is precisely why radical alternatives to the circle of life are virtually absent from the films in the franchise. The philosophy of Hakuna Matata, professed by Timon and Pumbaa, offers individual escapism, but not a systemic solution. The ideology of the hyenas, if it exists at all, is caricatured as a simple desire for chaos and destruction. Even in the second film, where the conflict is mitigated through the reunification of divided prides, the fundamental structure of power remains unchanged. The status quo is restored through the integration of former outsiders, but not through the... This conceptual limitation reflects a broader problem in political philosophy. It is easier to criticize existing systems than to imagine alternatives that actually work. As British cultural theorist Mark Fisher noted, it is easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Similarly, in the context of Pride Lands, it is easier to imagine the ecological disaster brought about by Cher's rule than a genuine alternative, and this is perhaps the most important lesson we can draw from our analysis. The circle of life is not just a beautiful metaphor or an ecological concept. It is a fully fledged ideological system that shapes how its participants understand the world and their place in it. It determines what is considered natural, normal, right, and what is deviant, dangerous, unacceptable. And like any ideology, it works best when it remains invisible, when its constructs are accepted as givens rather than subjected to critical. And perhaps this is the real lesson of The Lion King, not the unquestioning acceptance of the circle of life, but the need to be critical of any natural order. The ability to see the political behind the seemingly natural, the constructed behind the seemingly given, the historical. When we stop perceiving the circle of life as a simple ecological truth and begin to see its political and ideological dimensions, we gain a new perspective not only for understanding the world of Pride Lands, but also for analyzing our own society. After all, in our world, dominant ideologies are often presented as natural laws, and existing hierarchies as the inevitable consequence of a certain natural order. Perhaps the main value of the critical analysis of the circle of life lies precisely in this transfer to our own reality. It reminds us of the need to constantly ask questions about who benefits from existing systems, who formulates their justifying narratives, and what alternatives remain invisible due to the limitations of our. Finally, such analysis forces us to think about the role of art in shaping our understanding of the world. The Lion King is not just entertainment. It is a powerful ideological text that shapes a certain view of nature, society, power, and justice. And when we learn to read this text critically, recognizing its ideological constructs, we take the first step toward a deeper understanding not only of fictional worlds, but also of the real world in which we live. So perhaps the real question we should be asking ourselves is, what circles of life exist in our own society? What ideological systems are so deeply rooted in our consciousness that we take them for granted? And most importantly, what alternatives to these systems can we imagine if we free ourselves from the constraints of dominant narratives? After all, as in the world of Pride Lands, real power does not belong to those who sit on the throne, but to those who determine what we think and how we understand the world around us. And the first step toward changing this world is to learn to see it as it is, not as it is presented to us by those who benefit from the existing order.